All right. Well, I have Jen with me. How's it going, Jen?
Oh, it's going great. Thank you.
Good, good. Well, I'm really glad to have you. It's always good to have existing clients of Omni Lab on this too. We've been trying to pull more and more folks that already work with us onto this. A lot of times we'll actually reach out to new people that either are saying something on LinkedIn or people we might want to work with in the future. So awesome having someone that we already have a relationship with and kind of jam on stuff a little bit. But I know we're going to get it into all things ABM based off of a little bit of your past experience and also to a degree at Wyng too. But I know especially at Bloomreach, you had the title of, I believe, something related to ABM. I can't remember it off the top of my head now, but you can tell me more about that in a second. But I thought it'd be interesting to kind of dive into that because it's one of these topics that I think there's a lot of misconceptions around what ABM is and what it isn't. There's a lot of people that would say, hey, ABM isn't display ads and you don't need tech to actually do it. And there's all these types of considerations that I thought we could get into that would be interesting. But before we get into all that, maybe just like a quick little bit of background on maybe your role at Wyng right now. And then I guess a tie to how you got into ABM at Bloomreach, if that was your first kind of starting point into it, or if it started before that. Love to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So right now I'm the director of marketing at Wyng. So that includes demand generation, product marketing, content marketing, all the good stuff.
The works.
The works.
Yep.
Before Wyng, I was at Bloomreach where I was the head of account-based marketing. Before that, I had another role in B2B SaaS where I did account-based marketing as well. I started out as a field marketer, and in field marketing, marketing and sales work very closely together. You're defining sort of your niche audiences and figuring out more geographically what is really going to work for that niche audience. And so as a field marketer, my manager, I think, went to like a serious decisions conference. And back then, ABM was sort of this new term, but she came back from that conference and said, we got to do ABM. And Jen, you're positioned really well already because of your relationship with sales. Do you want to run with it? And I said, sure. Okay. Yeah. Let me do some research about what that means. So I've probably been, focused on account-based marketing for the last like 5 to 6 years, really exclusively in my roles. And it's been an interesting journey for sure. I have I now know really what not to do.
Love that. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I've learned a lot along the way. So I'm excited to sort of dig into it here because I think as you said, there are a lot of misconceptions or myths around ABM. What does it really mean? So hopefully this will be helpful today for some marketers.
Yeah, I love that. I also love how it's one of these things where you go to an event and, your marketing leader goes to it, gets all excited about a pitch, and there's all this social proof and backing and all these people here that are high-fiving and saying, this is great. And then immediately becomes a budget priority that we have to do this thing called ABM. But anyway, well, cool. I think that makes sense. Well, I guess maybe to give a little bit of context, I'll maybe kick it off and then we can get into a few things that we laid out before. But I think, like you said, there's a lot of misconceptions about what ABM is and isn't. And maybe I'll let you kind of give your take first, since you're probably even more the expert than I am. I haven't been in a ABM role directly, but certainly seen a lot of ABM plays rolled out across a number of different SaaS companies. So maybe we just start there about maybe some misconceptions about what it is and what it isn't. And then I'll kind of give my take too and go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I think at the simplest definition of it, it's targeting the right people at the right time with the right message in the right place, right? So a lot of people can just think, oh, like that sounds like really good marketing, right? So when we talk about targeting the right people, I think in ABM, typically people talk about fit, like account fit, right? And we can dive into, how do you select your target account list, things like that.
Exactly.
At the right time, a lot of the time in ABM terms, like we're talking about intent, right? Like when is it at the exact right time to reach out to an account based on the intent that they're showing on third-party websites or your website? Messaging, self-explanatory, and then in the right places, the right channel. Not all channels are the same. Not all people visit all channels, right? So really narrowing down and figuring out what works for your particular audience. So simplest sense, I would say that's what ABM is. A couple of other things. I mean, I think ABM is making sure that you understand that, not all customer and prospects are the same and you shouldn't treat them as such. So,
agreed. Yep.
I mean, you're going to have accounts by nature that are more valuable for your business, right? Maybe they're more valuable because of the deal size they could turn out to be, or maybe you just really want that logo, right? And with ABM, you should realize that I'm willing to spend more money on those top accounts because I realize that the turn is going to be even bigger for me at the end, right?
Right.
And then I would say that probably the last thing is that true partnership between marketing and sales. This is probably pretty cliche by now, but that like ABM is a misnomer because it's not about marketing. It's about marketing and sales and product and so many other departments. And we can talk more about this, like specifically what does good marketing and sales alignment look like. But to me, those are the crux of like ABM. I don't think that you need to have this huge, humongous tech stack to do ABM well. I think that, you know, it absolutely helps if you're a more mature organization and you have the budget for it. But I don't think having an ABM platform or having a direct mail platform is what makes somebody do ABM, right?
Yeah. I love that definition. That's a pretty comprehensive one. So many things we could dig into all of those different points. But yeah, I think you said it. I mean, the one thing I guess that I pull back to is it's really just good marketing at the end of the day, you know? And so when you think about it, we're all familiar with one-to-many, one-to-few, one-to-one. And so ultimately our goal as marketers is always to develop a message or a piece of content to a very specific audience to make it the most relevant as possible. So that ultimately the message resonates, whatever we're trying to communicate, and that they ultimately feel that we might be a solution to a problem that we're ultimately solving with our product. And so you can do that in a number of ways. But I think that's the big thing. The other thing I'd love to get your take on too, there's a lot of people that will talk about things like, you know, ABM isn't display ads. What's your take on that? Do you hear that a lot? That's a common thing we hear all the time on LinkedIn. People are always complaining about, oh, it's not just display ads. I don't know what you're talking about. And a lot of these tech vendors, of course, allow for targeting accounts through display ads. So what's your take there?
Yeah, I would say ABM is definitely not just about display ads, right? It's about, you know, sort of a business strategy to prioritize your top accounts and to go after those accounts in a multi-channel, multi-touch way, right? And ads can absolutely be part of that game plan, right? But if I had a limited budget, I wouldn't say ads would be the first place I would start, right? I would maybe just start with my SDR team and working with them on like super specific messaging and very specific accounts and titles to go outbound into, and then support them with maybe custom landing pages from marketing or whatever it might be. But I mean, if I had a small budget and I was starting ABM, I don't know if I would go and dump a bunch of money into ads, right? I would try maybe some different tactics. But ads are definitely great. And yes, they can move the needle if you have the ability to spend.
Yeah, 100%. It also pulls me back to, you know, so I actually came from sales initially before I get into marketing. And so, you know, for me, it's a little bit funny kind of coming up to speed over the last years with ABM, and that, you know, as a salesperson, we always had target accounts. We were always doing personalized messaging. Generally speaking, we had somewhere between 50 to 150 accounts, which is kind of in that similar range that you might do for a targeted ABM style campaign, depending on how many resources and budget you have. So I think it's obviously great. And to your point about alignment, that now marketing is also saying, hey, great. Sales has been doing a lot of these targeted strategies for a long while. They've been doing cold emails. They've been doing personalized outreach through LinkedIn. They had a small target account list. I mean, most reps, unless you're an SMB type rep where you've got a very broad focus, most of your ACVs above like 25K, everyone's got a list. Like everyone has it. The list exists somewhere, right? And so, so I think that connection to your point with marketing and sales is so crucial, because if it's not there, then you can't get some of the support you need to really make that successful across a whole number of other areas. And you mentioned field events, which I thought is interesting too, because you had a lot of background there, which that's a huge part of it, right? It's not just cold emails and cold calls and LinkedIn outreach and being personalized with a target account list. There's a whole number of other factors. And because people are hanging out on different channels, right? No one just hangs out on a couple of channels, like you said. So, well, cool. Well, so maybe we can kind of identify like what, when is ABM a good fit? Like when is it a good time to do ABM, and maybe when is it not? Like, are there situations where you'd say like, you definitely should not even think about doing ABM? What would those situations be?
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer this question, I'm going to focus on one-to-one ABM. I also think that's sort of what people gravitate towards when they hear the term ABM. They automatically think one-to-one.
Sure.
So before doing one-to-one ABM, I would say definitely don't do it if you don't have executive alignment across marketing and sales, right? One-to-one ABM takes a while to work. You're breaking into large accounts where things are very noisy, where deal cycles are slow by nature because of the number of stakeholders that need to make that decision. So if you have execs that are very much like volume driven, like I just want to see MQLs, I want to make sure that my sales rep is really getting a bunch of inbound, right? Like these are things that to me might cause me to say, oh, okay, red flags. Maybe we need just some education about what ABM is before we really undergo that as an effort, right? So I would say definitely if you don't have that marketing, sales, exec alignment, and you haven't defined the success metrics of what is success going to look like for ABM, then I that's my first step. I wouldn't go further than that.
And what else, maybe we'll stop there real quick, because that's a good point. Because I think that's actually the crux of everything. If you get that wrong, then you're going to have a huge amount of problems downstream. So you mentioned one thing, which is aligning on the measure of success. And I'm jumping around a little bit in my agenda here, but in terms of defining that, how do you think about that? Because you just said the word takes time, right? This takes time. It's not something where you go to Coca-Cola, you send a couple of emails, you run a couple of targeted ads or something like that, and all of a sudden Coca-Cola's like, yeah, we need this thing. This is awesome, right? Like, what's your thought around measure of success and having that conversation? Because I think it's not an easy one, especially when you're trying to deliver some short-term results, but also keep in mind the longer-term plays that, hey, we are going after accounts where they might spend $50,000 to $100,000 plus with us, so it's not going to happen overnight. How do you navigate that in the beginning? Because I think those are the tough conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you level set and say, hey, when we really get this engine going, we're going to be able to measure success off of new business and expansion ARR, right? That will happen one day, but it's going to take some time. So let's walk ourselves back. Right? If we can't measure on ARR, what's sort of the thing before that we can measure? Oh, okay, great. Qualified pipeline. All right. Before qualified pipeline, is it meetings booked? Okay, great. Right. Before that, is it accounts engaged? So there's a lot of ABM platforms, right, that will sort of aggregate account web activity, account intent, account interaction with your downloads or events, and kind of put together this like MQA metric. So we could use that as a baseline, right? Before even accounts engaged, can you do accounts reached? So how many accounts are you going after, and how many of those have had SDR activity, have had ads reach them, right? Have been involved in some sort of webinar. So I would say that walk it back, right? Figure out what matters for your organization in those like leading indicators, and use those, and make sure you're really vocal with it right at the beginning of, oh, okay, this is working. We're seeing more web visits from our target accounts, right? We're seeing more meetings booked at our target accounts. And eventually all those leading indicators will turn into actual pipeline and actual closed deals. But you got to level set at the beginning, right?
Agreed. I think one of the things that I will sometimes do is we'll ask either a founder or CEO to, if they have an unrealistic expectation around when results are going to come, then it's immediately like, all right, walk me through the last time that you were buying software. What are the things you did before you actually bought? And so they won't remember everything. Clearly, right? Our memories are horrible, most of it, certainly mine is. But they'll remember a handful of things along that journey. And it'll usually not be a situation, unless it was a lower transaction, type of tool or whatever, something under $100, under $1,000 or something like that. But for the bigger ones, they're going to say a lot of things. They're going to say, well, I talked to a friend in a Slack community, they mentioned it, then I went to this webinar. And then after that, I actually attended this really cool event where they did a talk. And then I got a couple of reach outs to this SDR. Maybe I ignored them there, but I did hear about them again. And I saw this ad on Facebook that kind of triggered me back again. And so they're going to they'll have a couple of things that will happen there. And so as soon as you get them to kind of walk through that, then I think it's a really great way to say, okay, well, let's set some realistic expectations. And to your point about focusing on some of the leading indicators initially, that hey, these things are still important. Yeah, it's not pipeline, it's not revenue. Yeah, of course, every marketer wants that. We all want pipeline and revenue. We're in the business of driving that. But at the same token, we can't just say that's the only thing we're going to report on, especially when you're going after big accounts, to your point, that aren't necessarily going to just convert after a handful of months running a campaign.
Yep.
So
Yep.
Yep. Agreed. In terms of like size ACV, are there any like little benchmarks in your mind, like the number of accounts you should go after? What's too many? What's too little? And then like size of ACV, is there like too little? Because
Yeah.
there's, I think, some numbers that always float around in our heads, but curious your take on that.
So I think that it's hard for me to define hard and fast numbers because it really is going to depend on your business, right?
Yep.
I would say that before trying to figure out like what average contract value am I aiming for, of whether or not I'm going to do ABM, like just really try to figure out what your ideal customer profile looks like, right? So your ideal customer profile sometimes gets like used synonymously with TAM, or target addressable market. And those are really two separate things, right?
Agreed.
Your target addressable market are anybody under the sun that could buy your product, right?
Yep.
ICP is way more defined. It's like, all right, well, who's a really good fit for our product? And I think you should look at where do you win, right? And ICP definitely needs to be something that is backed by data. So if I was going to develop an ICP for my business, I would say, okay, let me pull a report of all the closed won opportunities that we've had in the past 2 years. And let me start looking for similarities between those accounts that we've won. Is it dependent on their revenue, their employee count, their technographic data? Is it some sort of, event that happened that made them look for a new solution? Like try to find those things and try to make a data-driven decision about what your ICP is. Once you've done that, if your ICP tends to be larger accounts with larger deal cycles, with multiple stakeholders in the buying committee, like those are all signs that, yeah, you could probably benefit from some sort of ABM approach, right? If you end up looking at your ICP and you're like, oh, well, okay, we actually do way better with SMBs and like smaller mid markets, then maybe think about like a product-led growth strategy, right? Like I'm just kind of spitballing and throwing that out there.
Sure.
But like
Totally.
that probably is not, like, to me, that doesn't show leading indicators of like an ABM program, right?
Right.
So I think it depends. In terms for like the number of accounts that I would select for ABM, I think you first need to look like between marketing, between sales, between your business development team, like map out in your ideal world, if it's a top account, like what are all the things you would like to commit to that top account, right? What are the channels that you're going to commit to? Who are the stakeholders within the company that need to be involved with that account, right? And sort of say like, this is my pledge for one-to-one. This is my pledge for one-to-few. And this is my pledge for one-to-many. And then after you've decided what you're going to commit to, then decide, all right, reasonably a quarter, how many of these accounts can I do, right? So for a one-to-one strategy, like to me, that involves, a marketer, it involves an account executive, it involves an SDR, it involves a partner manager, and it probably involves somebody from customer success. It likely involves an executive sponsor, right? Like that's a huge time commitment from the company. And so at the end of the day, for one-to-one, a quarter, I mean, maybe you're doing like 5 to 10 accounts, right?
Wow.
And I would say that, one-to-few, I would say is probably maybe up to 50 accounts. And my one-to-many ABM, I wouldn't go over like 200 accounts. So those are kind of my gut sense. But like I said, it's all based on the commitment that your organization is going to put towards each of those accounts.
And the ACV is kind of the typical like 25 to 50K plus. If you're anything under that, then it might be harder for you to justify actually an ABM motion. You subscribe to that
for sure.
general range.
For sure.
Yeah. It's funny you said the bit about TAM and ICP. I actually just posted something about that today, and it's something that always drives me up the wall because your TAM, as you said, your total addressable market is the total amount of people that could at some point be a fit for your product. It's not necessarily who is a fit for your product today. And so a lot of people confuse that because the CEO or a lot of times leadership will sell the vision of the company where it's going to go. And the TAM is the number they use to sell investors on the market opportunity. But you don't execute against the TAM because those people are likely not, you might not have the enterprise features right now in your product. To your point about looking through your CRM, you may find that right now 80 to 90% of all your clients are SMB. And so now you've got all these other enterprise companies that may be in your TAM, but you don't have the social proof, you don't have the case studies, you don't have the enterprise features. You might, and you can get there, but you're not there today. So it's all about figuring out, hey, where can we be competitive right now and get some of those initial wins versus just throwing everyone into the channel. Like a lot of times when we're running ad campaigns, oh yeah, here's just my TAM list, go for it. Let's go after all of them, right? And a lot of times then that also waters down messaging and content. So you're trying to have a broad message that applies to all these people, which really doesn't work. It falls flat. So I think that's a really good point, because at the end of the day, like if you get targeting right from the top end, all that stuff becomes a lot easier, and you can even make a lot of mistakes along the way. But as long as that message is hitting the right person,
Yep.
you're going to have a much better chance of success.
Yep. I would say, as an ABM marketer, if I was putting together a campaign, almost more than 50% of my time was spent really curating that target account list and the exact people that I'm going after and what the exact message is, right?
100%.
The other 40% is like execution, right? And people think that that's like the bulk of the work. Like, no,
Exactly.
I spent way more time on the front end identifying truly the right people.
Exactly. 100%. You have to. Well, so you just gave me a good segue. So messaging, let's talk about that. So, I mean, messaging is always tough, right? Because for me, just to add a couple little tidbits before I ask you a question here is, I think what commonly happens is a lot of people just start throwing different messages all across the wall and just seeing what sticks. And, there has to be a true alignment all the way up to the top with the CEO, with everyone on, hey, what's the core narrative that we're trying to communicate to this audience? And then obviously from an ABM perspective, how can we then tailor that narrative to individual accounts? And so then there's even a step below that, right, which I'm sure you might agree with, is that then you've got all the different people in the buying committee. And if you really want to do something personalized, you might have specific messages to different types of people in the organization. And so how do you break that down? I mean, where does that come from? Do you align in the same way that I'm kind of talking about, where you're getting up and talking with senior leadership as well? Or has this just become a marketing thing and you just kind of do it and run it and then report back on it? Or what does that all look like?
Yeah. So I think you definitely have to be aligned with leadership, right? In order for ABM to work really well, it's going to be a multi-channel approach. And you can't have different messages across these different channels, right? People are going to get really, really confused. So you do need to have kind of like your North Star messaging, right? And if that's not figured out, it's going to be hard to do ABM really well. But once you have that North Star messaging, then you're right. Like, look at the account and what matters to the account, right? So you need to understand how your product fits with the account's strategic priorities. So do research on the account's strategic priorities, like pull up their annual report, right? If they're a public company, they have to do reports every fiscal quarter. So like pull those up and read those. Look for interviews from their executives to figure out what their executives are talking about and what's important to them. And then in your messaging, make sure to use the terms that they use, right? One of my biggest pet peeves is, and I've been at fault with it too, is, we always say, oh, engage your customers. You want to reach your customers. There are some companies that don't call their customers customers. They call them consumers. They call them champions. They call them fans.
Right.
And at the very beginning, if you're just like not using the language that you're using on that like basis thing, they're going to negate you, right?
So true.
Like,
so true.
It doesn't matter how great all the rest of your marketing is. So it's just, that might seem like a silly example, but it does matter. So I would look at the account, and then you're right. Like, you need to understand by the different personas, like what is the message that's going to resonate best with them. Right.
Right.
And then like really equip your sales team and your SDR team with that, because they're the ones that are going to do the bulk of that one-to-one outreach.
Right. How do you break that down though? Is that like just like getting practical and kind of spitballing at some of the past companies you've worked with? Is that a grid, and you've got in this grid, right? Company 1, company 2, company 3, personas on the rows, and then you've got 3 core messages maybe inside those blocks, and then content, I guess, backing that messaging up if you're producing some type of personalized content for that. What does that look? I mean, how do you organize that?
How do you
practically speaking? How have you done in the past?
Absolutely. So what we would do in the past is, I guess maybe this whole account research phase. Let me start with that, right?
Yeah.
So typically what marketing would do is marketing would work with sales in order to identify what is the ICP. And then marketing, who has all of this amazing, typically like database of accounts or all of the intent data, like marketing is the one that puts together the target account list that sellers can choose from, right? So it's like, okay, great. Sellers, here are 200 accounts that I've identified that really fit our ICP. Now, seller, using your historical knowledge, using your like relationships, right? You figure out which are the top ones that we're really going to go after, right?
Got it.
So sellers will do that. They select, okay, here's my top 5, right? After that, we would typically have an account planning meeting. And in that planning meeting would be the marketer, the AE, the SDR, and usually somebody from partner marketing or the channel team. And we would all sit down and say, okay, let's divvy out the research that we need to do on this account and the contacts, right? So marketing, you're going to take like industry dynamics, right? What's going on that in the industry or in the market that this account is likely feeling, right? SDR, you're going to take all of the contacts. We know that these are the personas that we typically go after, right? So find all the relevant titles that you can in these different personas. Seller, you're going to be in charge of, history that we have with the account, as well as, researching the sort of like executive strategic priorities, right? Channel team, you're going to go and surface this list to all of our channel partners, figure out if any of them currently work with this account, right? So then you do all of that research, you bring it all together, and then you say, okay, what's the main core message that we're going after, and then once you have that main core message, typically what I would do as a marketer is I would say, okay, let me pull together for the different personas, different supportive social proof that you might need, or different assets that you might need in order to go after this person, right? Typically, we're not creating a bunch of stuff from scratch. We're just pulling from our existing content and curating what is really needed to resonate with each of those people, right? Something else that I might do, though, that has worked really well in the past is if we understand what the overall message is for the account, then we'll create almost like a landing page hub for that account. So it's a little bit more general. It's not targeted for each of the different titles, but it's a hub that has relevant case studies that account is likely interested in because they are the same industry, or maybe they use the same installed technology. It will have the faces of the people that are who are reaching out to them on that account page. That account page might have a personalized greeting from one of our executives, right? Saying, "Oh, so glad! Like this is how this is how we envision that we could partner together." So it's a curated hub, and that hub can change throughout the cycle of the account, right? Like it's very different when they don't have any realization of who your business is, but as they get through the deal cycle, you want to add more assets. If they always know that they can kind of go to that page, right? So that's how it has been done in the past. Hopefully that was specific enough.
No, that was great. That was even more than I was looking for. I love it. Yeah, I think he hit it. I mean, yeah, I don't think I'd add anything to that. I think that there's a lot of it. I think it's always a question of, most marketing teams don't have enough resources, especially now. Some teams' budgets have been cut or put on pause or lowered. And so now, we're all still trying to run around hitting maybe the same or similar goals as before. And so I think, especially when you're trying to take this on, it's all about prioritization. And I think with content, there's so many types of content that we could potentially create. I mean, there's field events, there's blogs, there's guides, there's custom landing pages with custom use cases and social proof. There's the cold emails that need to be written and developed. There's sequences. There's all this stuff, right, that's being created. And I guess for you, is there a place like maybe you would start where you'd say, hey, we're just going to limit it to these couple of core things and then build off from it, and anything that stands out to you in specific? Because I think the other interesting thing I've been hearing a lot about is people actually using podcasts like this one to do ABM-like plays where they can do more content collaboration with either existing customers or prospective customers, and get the actual customers, whether current or not, involved in the process. So then you've got, Wyng or X company next to each other, and they can both see, oh, wow, like I know that company and they're associating with this company. And so then there's automatically this kind of credibility that builds. So I think there's that type of content as well. But some people are, I'm not ready. I don't know what we do with the podcast or who's going to manage it, or I need to see the ROI like now. And so for that reason, we can't really do it and we can't track it easily. And so there's all these things to kind of consider. But I guess the main question is content. Like, how do you think about what content to prioritize in an ABM motion? Or do you just try to do a lot of different things all at the same time?
Yeah. So if you're working with limited budget and limited resources, I would say don't try to spin up new channels or new things in order to do your ABM program. Like, take what you've been doing and see, is there a way that I can get more targeted with this, right? Events is a really good one. A lot of companies spend a lot of money to get a booth on a showroom floor, right? Which is great. Usually what I've seen is that's better at like targeting practitioners than it is executives, right? And if you want to go after a specific set of accounts and their executives, then maybe what you do is you, instead of doing that large booth on a trade show floor, is you take a smaller booth and then you use some of that for like one-to-one meetings or to host a luncheon at that trade show. Like, figure out how you can use the same budget in a slightly different, more targeted way. Same thing with ads, right? You are probably using LinkedIn already, right? To run ads. All right, take part of that LinkedIn budget and say, okay, let me try it out on one-to-one ads, right? Or let me try it out to one-to-few ads and make sure that I give a very curated target account list and specific messaging points for that industry, whatever it might be. So I also think like webinars. Lots of companies host webinars, right? They're usually seen as sort of like a larger demand gen or lead gen activity. You can get really specific with how you target people for that webinar if you just adjust the messaging and what their takeaways are going to be for that particular account or industry. And then it could be the standard base webinar, but your follow-up is really curated, right? It's like, okay, on this webinar, you learned about this. Now here are specific examples of how that applies to you.
Right.
So I don't think that you need to go off and create all of these new things. Just curate what you have. But if you were going to start out and like really what moves the needle for ABM at the beginning, I would say is SDR outbound, honestly. So SDRs are great at giving real-time quick feedback. They're great at adjusting, at like telling you what works and what doesn't work. So like you could give, to start out, SDRs a very curated target account list, very target personas, and the exact message that you want to sell to them, and maybe a special offer, right? Like a special offer that only those accounts are getting. Is it a custom POC? Is it time with a particular exec at the company? Is it some sort of discount? What could it be? But try that out first. If you want to figure out like, if you want to prove like, will ABM work, try it out one to few with your SDR team with very specific messaging. That's my advice.
Yeah.
Once that's layer one. Layer two is, okay, great. Maybe do run LinkedIn ads. Start those LinkedIn ads a month before SDR outreach starts. So that way that account is starting to see your logo across their feed. There's some sort of brand recognition. So when that SDR reaches out, they're like, oh, okay, I've heard of that company before.
Yeah, that's a good point. We try to pull more of that data more frequently, but there's been 3 cases or 3 data points that we have thus far about not necessarily running certainly not a one-to-one, but more like a one-to-few play with a number of different SaaS companies. And then looking at historical conversion rates from cold email prior to those campaigns being launched and then after. And in every 3 instances, and 3 instances, not a lot of data points, trying to collect some more data. But I know I've also heard this anecdotally through a lot of other folks that, to your point, it can also help drive more conversions via cold, even if they're not coming in inbound, because there's automatically familiarity. And that plays into the psychological effect of familiarity bias. So if I'm seeing your name on LinkedIn a lot, and you're creating tons of content or putting out whatever, right? Or you're on these podcasts like this one, there's a clip of you. And then you reach out to me. I'm like, oh, I think I've seen her before. She just seems familiar. So number one, I'm probably going to be at least more interested in opening that email. And then 2, then the question is, do I have a need now? And is it really worth my time to have a conversation? So there's always going to be that battle between in-market and out-of-market buyers. But out of those 3 cases, conversion rates have gone up. So I think it's really important to consider some of those impacts versus just evaluating the success of paid or any channel for that matter just in isolation. And I think that's what's really difficult, because let me know if you agree at this point, and maybe this is idealistic, but I talked to a lot of different VPs of marketing about this, but I think we all want this world where at the end of the day, we choose 100 accounts or whatever the number is. Maybe it's less than that. Maybe it's 25, 50, depending on what you said, ACVs and all sorts of things. And we work as a team to open up those accounts. And we have leading indicators from whether it's engaged to meetings booked to pipeline, so on and so forth. And sure, we measure and look at what channel ultimately acquired that contact or that lead. But the goal is to just get X% of them opened up in a given quarter. And if we make that goal, we all win. And I think that creates a level of accountability across not only just sales, but also marketing, that we're now trying to work together more, versus as soon as you start chopping up goals and saying you're going to do this and you're going to do that and this channel is going to produce that, so on and so forth, it creates this kind of competitive environment and throws you down a whole bunch of rabbit holes trying to say who actually sourced this or that. And it's not to say you don't measure it, but it's to say that we can't forget the ultimate goal. What's your take on that? Do you agree with that or have a different perspective?
No, 100%. I mean, any ABM win is a team win, right? And so, I mean, agreed. I also think that if you try to attribute every dollar spent to every account close, like, you're going to miss out on channels that like really do matter, right? But that it's so hard to tie specific like cost per lead or cost per op to, right?
Right.
And to your point of like leveraging relationships, maybe that's another good point of like, how do you get started with ABM? Like, use the people at your company and the existing relationships. So if you have 100%. A target account list, surface that to everybody at the company and say, hey, does anybody have any contacts to anybody in these companies, right?
Agreed.
And that's a first great way to start, because of course, if you can get a warm intro, it's always going to be better than having to do it cold. So even that, and that just is like a good example of how it really is such like a team effort, right? Like everybody on board.
I don't know if you can do that. I don't know. There was a tool that I saw somewhere. I don't know if it was an ad or someone mentioned it or something, that was doing something related to exactly what you were talking about. Either that, or maybe there's some ways to better do that with LinkedIn Sales Navigator and things like that now. But yeah, 100%, because I think it's difficult. Certainly thinking about my days back when I was an SDR, you'd have this set of contacts or accounts that you're going after that you're responsible for, yet the person right next to you may have a relationship, and their dad or their cousin or brother or whoever or a friend works directly at a company you're going after, and could have way better opportunities of getting a conversion versus you going after that account cold. So I think, aggregating relationships across a team is so important. I can't remember the name of the tool. I don't know if you know one off the top of your head, but maybe this has started to be done more within LinkedIn Sales Navigator. I'm out of the loop.
Yeah, I think LinkedIn Sales Navigator with Team Link does a really good job of that. I'm sure there's other tools that do it as well. But yeah, I mean, that's huge, as great as you can get. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, let's close out. Any kind of final closing thoughts in terms of like, where do you think ABM is going to, I mean, we didn't really talk about ABX because honestly, I'm getting lost in all these buzzwords. And I think honestly, it's getting a little silly. There's going to be another one. And I joked about it, I think a few weeks ago, that we're going to get, the finance team and the, head of the parking lot, and everyone, in on this thing called ABM. Right. And so, but what does it look like in the future? I mean, I'm sure there's going to be another buzzword. We all know that because some other tech vendor is going to have to create a new category or something to define something differently. But what do you think is going to change, if anything? Or do you think it's really just going to continue and evolve?
Yeah. So you bring up ABX, which people will say is account-based experience. And I do think that is the future of ABM a little bit, being that, no matter how great your targeting is to the right account, if they're just not ready to buy, then it's kind of like, falling on deaf ears, right? And that's what ABX is. It's about figuring out like, what is the experience that somebody is having when they're buying a product like yours, and like when is the ideal time to reach out to them. So I do think that this whole the use of intent data in order to really curate your campaigns is going to be something that we see a lot more often. I think there's going to be more automation built out with, when accounts or people show intent, then this and this happens. So I do think we're going to see that. I also think that we're going to have a really interesting sort of upheaval with ABM tech vendors with the death of third-party cookies. And
that'll be fun.
it's going to have people rethink the way that they're using those tools in order to target their audiences. And I think it's going to make tech vendors be a little bit more accountable for the kind of like metrics and ROI that they show. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
100%.
I think this goes back to a really early point where, ABM is really just good marketing. And so I think we're just going to be seeing more and more businesses have this ABM approach, this more targeted approach.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's kind of what we always should have been doing, right? Certainly for the instances where you've got the ACV and some of the unit economics to make it make sense, but totally agreed. Well, it was awesome having you, of course. See you on Slack and all the places, or LinkedIn. How do people get in touch with you if they want to chat with you more about ABM or anything else related to this conversation? What's the best place to reach you?
Absolutely. LinkedIn is great. My name is Jennifer Sego. I work at Wyng, WYNG, and you're more than welcome to reach out there. I love to have, I love to hear what other people are doing as well in terms of ABM. So coffee chats, I'm all about it.
Love it. Love it. Well, cool. Well, then we'll wrap there and we'll chat a little later.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to another episode of the Demand Podcast. Again, I'm Jonathan Bland, the co-founder of Omni Lab. I'll also have with me Jason Steele, who's the other co-founder of Omni Lab on this podcast as well. We're a demand gen agency for seed to Series B SaaS startups. If you like this episode or you're looking for some help with demand gen, please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn over a DM, or you can go just directly to our website. That's omnilabconsulting.com. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on the next episode where we'll be talking about all things demand gen. Until then, thanks. Bye-bye.